It was the welcome return of the 250km long races for Supercars up in Townsville, with many things not seen since the opening round in Newcastle. We saw fuel and tyres play their biggest role in quite some time, and of course a Ford back on the top step of the podium. I'm here to discuss all that and much more as part of my round 6 review here on Fan at the Fence. We'll kick things off with a couple of race recaps, and the opening race of the weekend was an intense one, with Shane Van Gisbergen going full send down at turn 2 on the opening lap, running a few cars wide, but it was all fair as far as I could see, albeit a little bit clumsy. And later on during that opening lap, that aggression actually cost him as he got tangled up with Jack LeBrock. Later in the race, we saw some refueling issues during the pit stops, notably for DJR and Erebus, both of them suffering some sort of connection issue, not delivering the full expected amount of fuel into their vehicles. Both of those problems were rectified for Sunday, but back on the track we had another fire scare with sparks and flames spotted underneath Todd Hazelwood's Mustang. He then embarked on a bit of a weird situation where he stopped at multiple marshal posts like a door-to-door salesman, ultimately parking the car, and fortunately no serious damage appeared to be done underneath. That did bring out the safety car though, and upon the restart we saw the form for a lot of different vehicles fall or increase, and notably Chaz Mostert had a really good late race charge, putting on a show for the fans, fighting his way up to the podium. But while the pace fluctuated up and down the grid for a lot of drivers, Will Brown looked pretty strong the vast majority of the race, ultimately taking the victory over Brock Finney and Chaz Mostert in third. The headline going into race 2 was that Shane Van Gisbergen would start from the back after a difficult qualifying session earlier that morning. Meanwhile at the front, Cameron Waters and Jack LeBrock were on the front row, followed by Randall, who had the best start out of all of them but with nowhere to go. Halfway through that opening lap we saw some casualties. Shane Van Gisbergen was spun by Declan Fraser at the same spot he saw issues on Saturday, and just a few laps in we saw an early retirement for Chaz Mostert as well, with I believe it was a power steering failure. Later in the race we saw some really good battles, particularly between Brock Finney and Andre Heimgartner. Those went back and forth from corner to corner and over a couple of laps, which was really entertaining. And then late in the race we saw some political drama with Red Bull coming to blows with some team orders, and we'll chat about those a little bit later on. Meanwhile at the front, Anton De Pasquale held on for the win, something of a strategic masterclass from that team, ending not only a drought for his team but taking Ford's first on-track victory of the season. So that means that Anton De Pasquale got the top step of the podium, followed by Brody Kostecki, who bounced back from a challenging Saturday, and Andre Heimgartner once again up there in third, doing a very strong job for Brad Jones Racing. How'd all that stack up against my predictions? Well, not all that good, and as I always say, these are just a bit of fun, so don't take them too seriously, but I do like to throw some things out there and see how I go in my round previews. Now we come back, check the bank balance, and see where we are at. My first prediction was that we would see Cameron Waters win a race, and it looked pretty promising after both qualifying sessions, but unfortunately they just couldn't hang on to their tyres in either of the races, and unfortunately Waters didn't even get a podium despite that strong qualifying pace. So that's a nope on that one. The only prediction I've got right actually is that Shane Van Gisbergen would struggle. Now obviously struggle is a subjective word, so I put this down as not getting a single podium, and he got close on the Sunday but he didn't actually get up there. So that's the one tick I've got for myself, because my final prediction was a crash at turn 10. Now the logic on this one was that turn 10 has always been quite hairy with the rail tracks and the bumps there, and with the lower downforce on these cars and potentially more side-by-side action through there, we might see a tangle. Fortunately though, we did not, because we don't like seeing cars get too banged up, and that brings us to the carnage report. So as far as Townsville goes, it was actually a relatively clean weekend, not without its victims, though practice was pretty much clear. The only out of race incident I can recall is Chaz Mostert clipping the wall on the exit of turn 2 during a shootout lap, doing some pretty big damage to that front left. But once we got into the races, we of course saw the inevitable tangles. In race 1 we saw a clash with Mark Winterbottom and Nick Percat, with Percat doing an almighty burnout to get himself pointed in the right direction. I think he cleaned up Jack Smith during that as well, leading to even more carnage than there already was. Later on in that race we saw a really awkward incident between Tim Slade and James Golding, and that has won them an award from me, which you'll hear about a bit later on. And then in race 2 we saw Shane Van Gisbergen Gisbergen and Declan Fraser come together, as I touched on earlier, and then another weird one down at turn 11 with Macaulay Jones clashing with Davey Reynolds. A really clumsy incident for those two, but by and large, pretty clean. Now, normally I would take one of these on-track incidents and break it down in a bit more detail during Clash Chat, but the biggest clash this weekend wasn't on the circuit, it was over the airwaves, with Red Bull having team orders backfire on them for the whole world to see. So to break this one down in a little bit more detail, Brock Feeney was holding 4th in the dying stages of the Sunday race. Shane van Gisbergen came charging up behind him, overtaking him down into turn 11, and as Shane sailed up the road, his engineer came on the radio and said if he couldn't get Heimgartner for 3rd, he would have to return the 4th place to Brock Feeney. Now, this surprised SVG, I think, because he felt like he overtook Feeney pretty legitimately, and even as a fan watching on TV, it was pretty clear he had a lot more pace, so whether it was choreographed or not, I think that move for 4th was inevitable on pace alone. But for me, this was a weird one, because Red Bull's logic for swapping the cars back, which did happen in the end, was that Brock Feeney would pick up the round win if he finished in 4th. Now, this is an odd one for me because as far as I understand, and I could be looking like an idiot here, but I don't think Supercars award points anymore for a round victory. It's something of a informal accolade, a bit of bragging rights, but nothing really more. My question in this scenario is that if your teammates are really close in the championship, which they are, and it's only halfway through the season, which it is, why create this weird political situation where there's no obvious benefit for the team as a whole? Overall, it just seemed really unnecessary for me and distracted from what was otherwise a good comeback from the Red Bull team. I asked you guys what you thought of this whole incident, though 59 people voted in a pretty short space of time, so thank you for taking part. 39% of people said yes, Red Bull were right to ask Shane van Gisbergen to give that 4th place back up. 61%, the majority, but only really just, said no, and are sort of kind of aligning with where I am on this one. But yeah, really interesting scenario. The drivers seemed pretty cool after the race, but definitely an awkward one for the team to address. Alright, let's get some positivity going. Talking about the weekend wins, these are the things that I really enjoyed watching Supercars this weekend. The first one is Townsville and its atmosphere. I mentioned in my pre-season video that I was a bit worried about Townsville. It felt like it hadn't been the same event or with the same atmosphere since COVID, which is understandable to a certain extent, but this weekend it felt like that atmosphere that Townsville is known for. The Supercars race had that energy about it again. There seemed to be good crowds, good energy, good action both on and off the track, so it was good to see the event firing on all cylinders. My second key positive is that the races were strategically very intriguing for me. There was this 2-stop versus 3-stop question mark with different teams trying different things across the 2 races, so that kept things nice and interesting right until the end. And the 250-kilometer races also meant that we saw the cars and the drivers fluctuate in pace as each race went on. That meant that how they started and the cars that were strong at the start wouldn't necessarily be up the front at the end, so once again keeping things interesting in one of the longer races. And my final key positive is that Ford finally have a victory. Now, I'm a GM guy, but even I'm pretty happy about this one because, you know, I love seeing a battle. I love the rivalry between Ford and GM, and the whole talk so far this season has been all about parity, and not all of that is necessarily solved through a single victory. I don't know either way where it sits right now. That's for the tech heads at Supercars to work out, but I do think this is good for the sport. Hopefully this is a bit of a turning point for Ford and that we can see some really close Ford v Chev battles in the future, because that's what I watch Supercars for. I love that rivalry and the competition between the fan bases. As for my weekend woes, the things I didn't enjoy quite as much, I felt like both races had really quiet midpoints where the on-track action probably wasn't as exciting as I was hoping for. Now, over the course of 250 Ks, you know, some low points are to be expected, and we did have that good strategy battle in the background keeping things interesting, but yeah, I was expecting the actual wheel-to-wheel intensity to be a little bit higher than it was. On Sunday, we had a really odd issue with some on-track entertainment, some burnouts and drifting, lowering the track condition to the tune of over 2 seconds a lap right before the top 10 shootout, and unfortunately the track evolution that followed kind of ruined how close qualifying was and the top 10 shootout. So that was a really awkward one with the scheduling there. I'm all up for a slippery racetrack, but right before the top 10 shootout where that track evolution is such a big factor, probably wasn't the best scheduling. And then finally, my last weekend woe is something more of a championship woe, unfortunately, at this point, and that's that the parity debate continues to rumble on. Obviously, we saw a change for the Mustangs coming into this weekend, probably helped by the fact there's also being a Ford victory on track as well, but there's plenty of drivers and teams up and down the field that still aren't convinced that that Mustang is where it needs to be. As always, I don't have the data in front of me, nor the intelligence to interpret it, even if I did, but I think just this discussion and lack of confidence that does exist right now, right or wrong, is just bad for the championship. So fingers crossed they keep making inroads and that we get this sorted and the confidence levels back up before those big races coming up at Sandown and Bathurst. Moving swiftly on to some awards, the surprise of the weekend for me has to be Dick Johnson Racing taking the first on-track victory for Ford this season. I would have never predicted that. As you've seen in my predictions, I always thought Cam Waters would be the first to get that on-track win, especially after the Saturday with all those electrical issues that Anton De Pasquale had. I never saw that win coming on Sunday, so props to them for a good bounce back. My V7 award, who wasn't firing on all cylinders, I have to give this to New Lom Racing. They had the weirdest teammate collision on the Saturday that saw James Golden get launched in the air, and then backed it up on Sunday by pushing Tim Slade out of the garage into the path of one of the truck assist cars, narrowly avoiding what could have been a really nasty accident. So clumsy weekend all round for them. Who gave it the jandal? I've got to give this one to Chaz Mostert for his safety car restart on the Saturday. He went full send in that Mustang. It was so good to see one of these Gen 3 cars really be pushed to its limits. Didn't have the best Sunday, unfortunately, but Saturday was certainly entertaining for us watching at home. And my special shout out has to go to Tony Quinn, getting back in a race car around the streets of Townsville after a huge crash at this location last year that put him in hospital in a really bad way. So props to him not only for his recovery, but the confidence and the courage to get back in a race car around the streets of Townsville. As for my weekend rating, I'm going to put this one down at 4 out of 5 stars. As I said, the racing intensity wheel to wheel probably wasn't quite as high as I was hoping for, but overall there was some good racing, some good battles, and plenty to keep us entertained throughout the whole race. As for what you guys thought, 58 people gave me their weekend rating, 71% of those went for 4 stars, 12% 3 stars, and 17% went for 5 stars. 0% going for 1 or 2, which is the first time I think I've seen that, so clearly people starting to get a little bit more confidence in the Gen 3 product, and hopefully it keeps going from strength to strength. As always, I like to finish up with some comments and talking points from you guys. So the first one we've got here is someone saying, finally, we had tires that degraded, which made for some good strategies. And yeah, I would agree with this. The 250-kilometer races, they're a bit of a favorite format for me. I really do like them for that reason. And the other thing I noticed, I felt like the majority of wheel-to-wheel battles that we did see were thanks to the tire wear as well. So it's a really interesting predicament. You don't want tires that overheat, which we have heard complained about this year, but when they do properly degrade, not necessarily their temperature that's the problem, that we do see some good wheel-to-wheel battles. So yeah, potentially, hopefully Supercars and Dunlop are taking notes that we can see even more competitive tires that encourage close racing in 2024. Next one here from Brody saying, it was nice to see some clean racing in the Dunlop series and Toyota 86s. For categories notorious for safety cars and time certain finishes, they really kept it clean. I only caught up with the Dunlop series outside of Supercars this weekend, but from what I saw, I certainly agree it was a lot better than I expected, especially around the streets of Townsville. That's great for everybody. It's great for the fans, it's great for the teams, because everyone spends all this money to be there, so you actually want to see the guys race and not just lap under caution. So props to all the drivers. From what I saw in the Dunlop series, the racing was still intense as anything, but yeah, hats off to everyone for keeping it mostly clean. And then the final comment here from Jeremy saying, SVG again going from last to the front, he wasn't expecting that. Yeah, this is a really good point. I haven't really talked that much about SVG other than the fact he didn't get a podium, but that Sunday drive in particular was very good considering he also got spun out on lap 1. Yeah, really good effort. He's still carrying an issue, it sounds like, with that car not tracking straight under brakes. Bit of an odd one, but it must be an absolute nightmare on a street circuit. So yeah, despite not being fully in love with Gen 3, it's still good that he can put on a show. And that then brings us to the championship standings, where things just continue to tighten up. Will Brown, thanks to his exploits this weekend, has landed himself in the championship lead, followed narrowly by his teammate Brody Kostecki. Brock Feeney up there in 3rd, Shane Van Gisbergen in 4th, and Chaz Mostert still there in 5th. Now, this championship just continues to bubble away really nicely. I hope the Enduros don't blow this open, because if it stays this close to the last round, it is going to be exciting. And then on the team's front, it remains close as well. Erebus still leading the way, followed by Red Bull and Pole Racing, and further down the field, much bigger gap, Brad Jones Racing, Tickford, and Team 18. Attention now turns to the next round of racing, a night race in late July at the Barry Repair Sydney Super Night. Completely different track, but hopefully some exciting racing to be had around there. But before we finish up, I just want to say a huge thank you for 1,000 subscribers. At the time of recording, we're only just marginally over that milestone, and depending on how some of the things I've said today land with people, we may have even dropped below it, but we're more or less at that milestone now, so I did want to take this opportunity to say thank you, whether you've been here since the start or just joined us in recent weeks. You guys have been hitting it out of the park with the support, and I'm really grateful for it. But as always, let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Remember to treat people like your trackside down there, and I will see you in the next video.